Okay, so at this point, I'd like to move on to the main part of the presentation, which will be delivered by Anton, Special Projects Manager at Camden BRI. He will take you through the majority of the content. So, Anton, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So let's just cut to the chase. By way of background, when food is processed, quite often it's possible that molecules are generated which can be of toxicological significance, and these are known as process-induced food toxicants. Now, there are many such kinds of molecules: acrylamide, hydroxycyclic aromatic amines, benzopyrene, chloroprophenols, and so forth. But today, we're going to focus on acrylamide. Now, what's important to understand is that acrylamide is formed as part of a generalized reaction within food called the Maillard reaction. And essentially, the Maillard reaction is one between a sugar and an amine, usually an amino acid. And when you heat the food, these two react together, and more often than not, we're generating flavor and we're generating color. So the Maillard reaction is very, very important for the quality of the food, and it gives or contributes to the attributes that the consumer wants. Under certain circumstances, though, you can get one form of the Maillard reaction where a reducing sugar reacts with the amino acid asparagine, and under fairly dry conditions and high temperatures, usually above 120 Celsius, you can produce acrylamide. And acrylamide, as we've discussed, is a process-induced food toxicant. Acrylamide first came to importance in food toxicology in the early part of the century, when it was realized that it was actually a historic component of the diet. What makes it important is that it's a probable human carcinogen. Now, although there is no epidemiological evidence to link acrylamide with human cancers, the risk to the population cannot be discounted. And as a result, risk assessors around the world have advocated that we should reduce exposure as much as possible. And in technical terms, this is expressed as the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable. And to that end, research all around the world has been performed, which is now informing industry best practice, so that food manufacturers and businesses can produce foods which are acceptable to the consumer but have reduced levels of acrylamide. Now, within the Anglophone world, two standard texts are the Food Drink Europe Acrylamide Toolbox. The last version came out in January 2014. And then more recently in the United Kingdom, we've seen the UK Hospitality Guide to Mitigating Acrylamide primarily in catering establishments. So these describe ways which can be introduced into food safety management systems and general practices to mitigate acrylamide formation in specific foods. As I've said, the best practice is based on research, and this is over a number of years. It's been funded by both industry and also governments. It only applies to certain food groups, and the guidance is that you generally have to pick and choose mitigation steps to achieve as low as reasonably achievable, because ALARA actually implies that you must also consider product quality and other food safety aspects. So, for example, in terms of product quality, it's no good selecting a method which generates a product which is visually unacceptable to the consumer. And similarly, if you modify temperature too much, you may then start to introduce other hazards like microbiological ones. So all of these factors have to be considered. Within the food safety management system, the basic strategies are, first of all, to minimize the precursors which lead to the formation of acrylamide. So depending on the product, It can be, for example, in French fry production or in potato chip manufacture and so forth, that you control the long-term storage of potatoes. If you store potatoes below 6 degrees Celsius, there's a tendency for them to sweeten too much, and as a result, you increase the amount of reducing sugars in them, and consequently increase the amount of acrylamide that can be formed. Another way, for example, with cakes and so forth, is the choice of the sugar that's being used. So, for example, reducing glucose or fructose with sucrose, and in the case of some biscuits, replacing ammonium bicarbonate as the leavening agent with sodium bicarbonate or something similar. Another route which may be used is the use of the enzyme asparaginase, and this reacts with the free asparagine within the dough or something similar and degrades it. So all of these approaches, they minimize the precursor, less acrylamide. As an alternative or in tandem to these approaches, one can also optimize processing time and temperature. So reducing the amount of cooking time and the cooking temperature, so reducing the thermal input, and this in turn can lead to a reduction in acrylamide. Recently, within the European Union, a new regulation has come into force, and this actually specifically addresses the question of acrylamide, and it addresses the question of acrylamide in certain high-risk foods. It differentiates food business operators, essentially between food manufacturers, small retail outlets, and large retail outlets, for example, chains, restaurant chains, and so forth. And what it does is that it actually specifies mitigation measures. And these mitigation measures are taken for what's considered to be best practice. And they are both food and food business operator dependent. Critically, the regulation establishes benchmark levels. And I'll go into more details about those later on. But these are a metric against which you can measure the efficacy of the acrylamide mitigation system, and that involves actually testing the food for the presence of acrylamide. It also sets laboratory test criteria. So these actually define the test parameters that a laboratory must meet in order to generate appropriate data for acrylamide management. The regulation identifies high-risk foods, and the list is actually quite restrictive. So looking, for example, at sections A and B of the regulation in connection with potato-based foods, it covers French fries and other deep-fried products, and that would include potato crisps, and then it looks at products made from potato doughs. Interestingly, it doesn't address foods like roast potatoes, nor does it address another potato-based food, for example, rösti, which has also been associated with high acrylamide levels. These are actually excluded from the provisions of the regulation. It covers certain bakery products, like bread, fine bakery wares, breakfast cereals, coffee substitutes, and also baby food. So, as I emphasized before, the list is actually quite restricted as to what's addressed within the European Union regulation. Moving on, the regulation actually requires that large food business operators, so these are generally manufacturers of the foods I've just talked about, or the large retail restaurant chains who are using, for example, deep fryers, they are expected actually to analyze high-risk foods for the presence of acrylamide, and then they are to compare the outputs of those with the benchmark values which have been established by the European Union. These are detailed in Annex 4 of the regulation. If it's found that the benchmark values are exceeded, then food business operators are obliged to review their mitigation steps and then take decisions as to whether or not it's necessary to change the processing conditions. It's important to realize that almost uniquely in contaminants legislation, benchmark levels are not maximum residue limits. They have no enforcement purpose. They are simply a guide to businesses as to whether or not their food safety management systems are adequate. And this has been emphasized, for example, by the United Kingdom Food Standards Agency, who have actually stated that they cannot be used for enforcement purposes. The implications for food business operators are detailed in this slide. So in terms of supply quality assurance, businesses have to take care in raw material selection and handling. So for example, within the potato, crisp and chip industry, there are now varieties of potato which are more resilient to producing sugars in cold storage. We handle potatoes in a manner which minimizes sugar production. We also need to look at other processed materials, for example, roasted nuts, and within the regulation there is guidance as to what the maximum level of acrylamide should be in these. All of this then impacts on new product development, so we have to look at ingredient selection, what type of sugars are we using, and then what kind of process operations conditions we're going to be working with. And then all of this then feeds into the food safety management systems. So, for example, are frying conditions an operational prerequisite, or are they a critical control point? It's going to be necessary to validate and verify that those systems are operational and effective, and this will be supported, at least demonstrated to a scientific endpoint through analysis. It's very important that the regulation is read carefully and applied appropriately. There is a danger of regulation by extrapolation. So what we are finding is that we are getting inquiries about many more products which are not produced under conditions which would lead to acrylamide formation or are not covered by the regulation. This has the potential of diluting the food safety management system, and also can mean that businesses are testing materials for which they don't need to test, and also in a manner in which they do not understand or will not be able to apply the data once it's generated. It's also important to remember that the Maillard reaction is actually also a force for good. It determines color and flavor, but there are also non-Maillard routes to color. So, for example, caramelization. What this means then is that certain products which have been associated with acrylamide formation are not addressed by the regulation, but it may be prudent for food businesses to take that into account. Some products which appear to be colored and potentially have acrylamide in won't, because the reaction mechanisms are different. But the overall message is one that was put forward by the Food Standards Agency some years ago, and it's advised both to food business operators and also to people cooking their own food in their own kitchens, which is go for gold. A lighter color is implicitly going to reduce the risk of increased or excessive acrylamide concentrations. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Anton. That was a fantastic overview of the latest position with regards to acrylamide. Hopefully you all found the content useful. I'd just like to go through a few slides to tell you how you can find out more in your own time. Most of you will have been registered for our news feed. That's how you will have found out about the webinar in the first place. But we have got a whole range of different topics So if you go to the Camden BRI website, there's a link at the bottom of the page there. You can choose and review your newsfeed preferences to make sure they stay in line with your interests. So that's worth a look. Most of you today will be members of Camden BRI. Some of you have probably attended the member interest groups before, but for those of you that haven't, they're essentially free networking events for members where they discuss topical issues. They get presentations on regulatory affairs from external speakers on some of the member-funded research we're doing here. So if you haven't joined the MIG, they're well worth looking into. You can find out more, even if you can't attend the meetings themselves. You can still access all of the output, all the presentation slides, all of the minutes. It's well worth being on the distribution list. So Camden BRI Day is coming up later on in the year, on the 12th of June. So that's the annual open day for Camden BRI. It's worth saying registration is now open. So if you go to the website, you can register your interest and be kept up to date with what's going on there. And if you're planning on attending, we look forward to seeing you in the summer. If you use social media, then we're present on several different platforms. Just choose the one that's of most interest to you, and keep up to date with Camden BRI through social media. So that's all I wanted to say. We've got a few minutes now to look at some of your questions, if you'd like to send some through. So we have got one on the list already. It's relatively simple and straightforward. It's about the guidance documents that we saw earlier on. Presumably those are available. We can make a link available to everybody. They're online.
Both of those are online, so that they're available through the internet. So they're available free, gratis, and for nothing. Okay, excellent. So with that in mind, we'll be able to include those when we send out the presentation slides. I'll dig those out for you. So we've got another question about measurement of acrylamide using infrared spectroscopy and chemometrics. Is that something you've tried personally, or would we need to refer them to our chemistry department for that? It's not an approved method. The approved methods involve using liquid chromatography with an appropriate method of detection. So that would not be an approved method in terms of the regulation. Okay. Okay, so we've got a question here about asparaginase and its use in bread products. The question is, has there been much success observed using asparaginase in bread products? Is that something you can comment on? The enzyme manufacturers claim that it has. Okay. I'm just going through the list of questions that we have here. We've got one about responsibility for acrylamide assessment, so dry and wet cake mix manufacturers. Use of typical ingredients: flour, sugar, egg powder, milk powder. So the question is, what is the responsibility for those kind of manufacturers? Well, cakes are not addressed by the regulation to begin with. And the second thing is that until you actually bake the products, you are not going to produce the acrylamide. So it's unlikely that you're going to get significant amounts of acrylamide produced in a cake, because it's very much a wet system. The second thing is that it's going to be all dependent on who actually does the baking. Okay. So we've got a few more questions up on the screen there. We've got one saying, is a quick detection method being developed for intake mills? And without it, there's no way that millers can reduce the precursors of their purchased raw product. So can we say anything about that? It is part of the quest in terms of cereal breeders to actually produce strains which have lower levels of asparagine. So that's something that will progress as we go on. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
we've got a question about labelling here, but I think that's something that's better dealt with by our regulatory affairs team. I can put some contact details for the team in the follow-up email later on. I don't think that's something we can answer here. I've got another question saying, will there be set limits for roasted nuts?
At the moment, well, there are no set limits. I really must emphasise this. These are benchmark levels, so they're there for guidance. They are not maximum residue limits, so they have no enforcement quality about them. Within the regulation, there is reference to a maximum amount of acrylamide within certain types of nuts when they're used in breakfast cereal manufacture, for instance. But apart from that, there's nothing at the moment that we are aware of.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I think we've got to the end of the list of questions so far. No one more's come in. So we've been asked, do you think the benchmark levels will eventually become regulated as maximum levels?
That's really quite a matter of speculation. There are some member states who are very keen on doing that. There was a lot of debate before the present regulation came out. How feasible it is, and from a policy point of view, how realistic it is, that has to be questioned. And that's something that is really something for the policymakers to do.
Okay. So we've got a question here about information on reducing sugars and which ones are more effective for reducing acrylamide levels. Can we say anything about that?
It really depends on the finished product, because once you start changing the reducing sugars, you'll change the flavour and the colour. And so it really has to go on a case-by-case basis. There is a belief that in decreasing order, the sugars would be fructose followed by glucose followed by sucrose. But it very much depends on what the product is and the technology that's being used.
Okay, so we've got another question here about asparagine. The question says that sulfur is used to reduce asparagine levels in wheat, and because of that, there's little drive for breeding while that's a solution. So could it be a solution for other parts of the industry as well?
It only applies to cereals, and the question then comes over control of cultivation. And if you then have to import cereals from outside of your normal supply line, is that person going to be using sulfur as well? And that's a cost. So sulfur may be a means of reducing asparagine levels, but it will depend on the supply chain management as to how effective that can be. Okay,
excellent. So we've reached the end of the Q&A session now. I think we've also reached the end of the allotted time. I'm conscious that the time is pressing on. So if you do have any other questions, by all means contact us after the session today, and we'll do our best to get back to you. So all that remains to be said is thank you very much to Anton for the delivery of his presentation. It was very informative and gave a great overview of the latest situation. So thank you to everybody as well for joining us today and for setting aside the time to listen to the presentation. We hope you can join us for some of our future events, seminars, maybe even other webinars. So I'll circulate some information later on, including the presentation slides, how you can find out more. So enjoy the rest of your day, and all the best. Thank you very much.